You think your dog feels safe with you, but what if the way you love them is exactly what's breaking that trust? Daniel Carter believed he was doing everything right. He fed Shadow twice a day, took him on walks around the block, kept his water bowl full, and made sure he had a warm place to sleep every night. By every human standard, he was a good dog owner, and if you asked him, he would have said Shadow had a great life. But there was something Daniel didn't see, something small, quiet, almost invisible, happening every single day. Because while Daniel was living his routine, Shadow was learning something else entirely, not through words, not through rules, but through moments, tiny interactions that stacked up over time, moments where Daniel raised his voice just a little too sharply, moments where he reached out too quickly without warning, moments where he said Shadow's name but didn't follow it with anything meaningful, and none of it looked like harm, none of it felt cruel. But to a dog, those moments don't disappear, they register. They settle deep into the nervous system, shaping how safe or unsafe the world feels. And the truth is, dogs don't measure love the way humans do. They don't count meals or toys or how many miles you walk them each week. They measure safety, consistency, tone, presence. And over time, Shadow began to shift in ways Daniel barely noticed. He started turning his head away when Daniel reached for him. His body stiffened for just a second before relaxing. He chose the far side of the couch instead of curling up close. Subtle things, easy to ignore, easy to explain away. He's just tired. He's being weird. Maybe he's getting older. But what Daniel didn't realize was that these weren't random behaviors. They were messages, clear signals that something in their bond was changing, not because Shadow stopped loving him, but because Shadow no longer felt completely safe. And that's the part most people miss. Because you can love your dog deeply and still hurt them in ways you never intended. You can care for them every day and still slowly chip away at their trust without realizing it. And the hardest truth to accept is this: the problem isn't always what you do wrong on purpose, it's what you do every single day without thinking, the habits that feel normal, the reactions that seem harmless, the little things that, over time, teach your dog how to feel about you, and if you're not paying attention, you might already be doing it right now. Daniel did not notice the shift all at once, because nothing about it was loud or dramatic. It was quiet, gradual, almost polite, the kind of change that slips under your awareness until one day something feels different, and you cannot explain why. Every morning used to start the same way. Shadow would be waiting near the bedroom door, tail relaxed, eyes soft, ready for that first moment of connection. But lately, that moment had changed. Daniel would wake up, reach for his phone, scroll through messages, check emails, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes 10, and by the time he looked up, Shadow was no longer standing there. He would be lying down a few feet away, watching, not approaching, not interrupting, just waiting. And to Daniel, it seemed harmless. He would eventually call Shadow over, maybe give him a quick pat, pour his food, start the day. Nothing felt wrong, but to Shadow, that first moment mattered more than anything else, because in a dog's world, those early interactions set the tone for safety, for connection, for belonging, and when that connection is delayed or inconsistent, the message is not neutral, it lands somewhere deeper. Later that day, during a walk, Daniel would tighten the leash when Shadow stopped to sniff, saying, "Come on," in a slightly sharper tone, not angry, just impatient. He had places to be, things to do, and again, it felt normal, reasonable even. But Shadow's pace would change. His body would lower just a little, his movements becoming more cautious, more calculated, as if he was trying to avoid making the wrong decision. And then there were the small corrections, the quick no. When Shadow moved towards something on the ground, the sudden reach to pull him back, the repeated use of his name without consistency. Sometimes it led to praise, sometimes nothing happened, sometimes it meant stop immediately, and over time, Shadow began to hesitate, not because he did not understand, but because he was trying to predict what Daniel wanted. And the truth is, uncertainty does not feel safe to a dog. It feels like walking on unstable ground, never quite knowing where to place your next step. And this is where most people misunderstand their dogs. They think behavior is about obedience, about training, about control. But underneath all of that is something far more important: emotional clarity, the ability for The dog to feel secure in what is happening and what is expected, and when that clarity starts to fade, the bond begins to weaken in ways that are almost invisible at first. Shadow still followed Daniel from room to room, still lay near him in the evenings, still responded most of the time, but something had shifted in the quality of those interactions: less ease, less confidence, more hesitation, more distance, and Daniel, like most people, interpreted that change on the surface. Maybe Shadow was just being stubborn, maybe he needed more training, maybe it was just a phase, but what he did not realize was that these were not isolated behaviors, they were connected, each one pointing back to the same root, the way Shadow was starting to feel in his presence. And the most difficult part is that none of it came from neglect or cruelty. It came from everyday habits that looked completely normal. The kind of habits almost every dog owner repeats without ever questioning them, the kind that slowly, quietly, reshape the way a dog experiences the person they trust the most. It was a quiet Thursday evening when Daniel first felt it clearly, not in something Shadow did, but in something he did not do. He walked through the front door after a long day, keys in one hand, phone still in the other, expecting the usual sound of paws on hardwood, the familiar rhythm of Shadow coming to greet him. But this time, nothing, no footsteps, no wagging tail, just silence that felt heavier than it should have. He called Shadow's name once, casually, then again, a little louder. And a few seconds later, Shadow appeared from the living room, walking slowly, not rushing, not excited, just approaching. With a kind of careful neutrality that Daniel had never seen before, and for a moment it made him pause, because something about it did not feel right. But instead of sitting with that feeling, he brushed it off. He is just tired. He thought maybe he did not get enough exercise, maybe he needed more stimulation, so Daniel reached down to pet him, quick, automatic, the way he always did, but Shadow's response was almost imperceptible, a slight turn of the head, a blink that came a fraction too fast, a body that accepted the touch but did not lean into it, and that was the moment, small as it was, where the pattern became impossible to ignore, because this was not about one behavior, it was about a series of signals that had been building for weeks, maybe longer, signals that were easy to miss individually but impossible to deny when seen together. And what made it harder was that none of it looked like rejection. Shadow was still there, still close, still present, but the quality of his presence had changed, like a conversation where one person keeps speaking but the other has already started to withdraw. And this is where most people misunderstand what their dog is trying to say, because dogs do not create distance all at once, they create it gradually, politely, almost gently, they adjust their behavior in ways that avoid conflict, they soften their reactions instead of escalating them, and in doing so, they hide the very thing you need to see, discomfort, and that discomfort does not come from one big mistake, it comes from repetition, from patterns that slowly teach the dog what to expect from you, how predictable you are, how safe your presence feels, and without realizing it, Daniel had created a pattern that Shadow could no longer fully trust, not because Daniel was harsh or unkind, but because he was inconsistent, unpredictable in small but meaningful ways, sometimes warm, sometimes distracted, sometimes patient, sometimes rushed, and to a human, that feels normal, but to a dog, that inconsistency creates tension, because their world depends on clarity, on signals that make sense, on interactions that follow a pattern they can rely on, and when those signals become mixed, when the tone does not match the action, when the name does not lead to something positive, when touch comes without warning, the dog begins to hesitate, not out of disobedience, but out of uncertainty, and uncertainty, over time, becomes emotional distance, and emotional distance is the first sign that something in the relationship is starting to fracture, even if everything on the surface still looks the same. The next moment did not look like a breaking point, but it was, because sometimes the most important signals come in the smallest reactions. Daniel was sitting on the couch, reaching down absent-mindedly while watching television, his hand moving toward Shadow the same way it always had, automatic, unannounced, expecting the same quiet acceptance. But this time, something different happened. Shadow did not move away, he did not growl. He did not resist, instead, for just a fraction of a second, his body froze, completely still, his breath paused, his muscles tightened, And then just as quickly, he relaxed and allowed the touch, and if you were not looking for it, you would miss it entirely. But that brief moment of stillness was not random, it was not harmless, it was one of the clearest signals a dog can give before discomfort turns into something deeper, and Daniel almost missed it. Almost continued on like nothing had happened, but something about it lingered, that pause, that hesitation, that subtle shift in energy. It did not match the dog he thought he knew, because Shadow had always leaned into his touch before, always softened, always responded with ease, and now there was a gap, a delay, a moment where Shadow had to process whether the interaction was safe. And that is where the truth begins to surface. Because dogs do not suddenly stop trusting you, they start questioning you, moment by moment, interaction by interaction, until trust is no longer automatic. Until every approach requires evaluation, and the most difficult part to accept is that this process is often invisible to the person causing it. Daniel had not changed in any obvious way. He still fed Shadow, still walked him, still spoke to him every day, but the way he interacted in those small, repetitive moments had slowly shifted the emotional meaning behind his actions, and to Shadow, meaning is everything, because dogs do not interpret your intentions, they interpret your patterns, and when those patterns become inconsistent or unpredictable, the dog begins to adapt, not by confronting you, but by protecting themselves in subtle ways, by freezing instead of leaning in, by hesitating instead of approaching, by choosing distance instead of closeness. And each of those choices is not a rejection, it is a response to something that has been communicated over time, even if it was never meant to be communicated at all. And this is where most people misunderstand their role, because they look for big mistakes, obvious problems, moments where something clearly went wrong, but in reality, the damage is rarely caused by a single event, it is caused by repetition. By the same small behaviors happening over and over again, shaping the dog's emotional landscape without the owner ever realizing it. And the moment you start to see those patterns, the moment you recognize that the hesitation is not random, that the distance is not personality, that the silence is not calm, everything changes. Because now you are no longer asking what is wrong with your dog, you are asking what your dog has been trying to tell you all along, and whether you have been listening at all. The realization did not come all at once, it came in fragments, small pieces that did not make sense until they were seen together. Daniel sat there that night, his hand resting on Shadow's back. But this time he did not move, he did not reach again, he just watched, really watched, and for the first time, he started noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The way Shadow's eyes shifted slightly before making contact. The way his ears adjusted when Daniel spoke, the way his body seemed to wait for confirmation before relaxing. And it raised a question that Daniel had never asked himself before, not what is wrong with my dog, but what has my dog learned from me? Because every reaction, every tone, every repeated behavior teaches something, whether you mean it to or not. And when Daniel looked back at his own patterns, they suddenly felt different, calling Shadow's name from across the room without looking at him, expecting an instant response, then saying it again with more pressure when he did not come, reaching down to pet him while distracted, without giving any signal or warning, correcting behavior with a sharp word but never clearly showing what should come next. Rushing through walks instead of letting Shadow process the world the way he was wired to. None of it had felt wrong before, it had all felt normal, efficient, even responsible. But now, through Shadow's reactions, it began to look like something else, a series of mixed signals, moments where connection was inconsistent, where safety was assumed instead of communicated, and that is when the deeper truths started to take shape, because dogs do not measure your intentions. They measure your consistency, they learn from patterns, not promises, and if those patterns leave them uncertain, even in small ways, that uncertainty accumulates, it builds into hesitation, into distance, into a version of the relationship that feels different even if it looks the same on the surface. And the hardest part for Daniel was understanding that none of this came from lack of love. He loved Shadow deeply, genuinely, but love without awareness can still create confusion. And confusion is where trust begins to weaken, not disappear, but soften, lose its clarity, its certainty. And in that moment, sitting in the quiet, Daniel realized something that most people never stop to consider. That a dog can be right next to you, still following you, still responding, still part of your life, and yet feel completely different about you on the inside, and unless you are paying attention to those small signals, those tiny shifts in behavior, you will never see it happening. Because dogs do not announce when something is wrong, they adjust, they adapt, they try to make it work with what they are given, and the question is not whether your dog is loyal, because they are, the question is whether they feel safe enough to show it fully, or if something in your daily behavior has quietly taught them to hold back. The next step was not a dramatic change, it was a quiet shift in perspective, because once Daniel saw the pattern, he could not unsee it, and the hardest part was realizing that the behaviors he thought were harmless were actually shaping how Shadow experienced him every single day. So instead of trying to fix everything at once, Daniel started with something simple, something most people overlook, the way he said Shadow's name. Before, it had been automatic, casual, sometimes repeated without meaning, but now he paid attention. He said it once, clearly, with intention, and when Shadow looked at him, he followed through every time, a calm voice, a soft expression, a consistent outcome, and at first, nothing seemed to change. Shadow still hesitated, still watched carefully, but that was the point, because trust does not rebuild in a moment, it rebuilds through repetition, through predictability, through signals that finally make sense again. Then there was touch, something Daniel had always assumed was positive. But now he realized that even something as simple as reaching out could feel different depending on how it was done, so instead of moving towards Shadow without warning, he slowed down, gave him a second, let Shadow see the movement, process it, choose it, and something subtle began to shift, not immediately, not dramatically, but enough to notice, a slightly softer posture, a slightly longer moment before pulling away, and that is how progress looks when it is real. Not sudden, but steady, almost unnoticeable unless you are paying attention. During walks, Daniel changed something else, not the distance, not the route, but the pace. Instead of pulling Shadow along when he stopped to sniff, he waited, just for a few seconds, letting him engage with the world in the way his brain was designed to, and what he noticed was not just a behavioral change, but an emotional one. Shadow's movements became more fluid, less cautious, more confident, as if the ground beneath him felt more stable, and that is the connection most people miss, because when a dog feels understood, even in small ways, their entire state begins to shift, not because you taught them something new, but because you removed the uncertainty that was holding them back. And this is where the deeper realization began to take hold for Daniel, that the 7 daily patterns he had been repeating were not just habits, they were signals that had been shaping Shadow's perception of him without either of them realizing it, calling his name without consistency, correcting without clarity, touching without warning, rushing through moments that should have created connection, ignoring the small signs of stress, expecting obedience instead of understanding, and assuming that love alone was enough to maintain trust. Each of these patterns had seemed insignificant on their own, but together, they created a version of the relationship that felt unpredictable, and unpredictability is what breaks emotional safety for a dog, not because they stop caring, but because they start protecting themselves in quiet, subtle ways. And the most important thing Daniel understood in that moment was that none of this required perfection, it required awareness, because the moment you become aware of what your dog is actually experiencing, everything you do begins to change, not out of obligation, but out of understanding, and that is the point where the relationship starts to rebuild, not through control, not through correction, but through clarity, consistency, and a kind of attention that most people never realize their dog has been needing all along. At first, the changes Daniel made felt almost invisible, like he was doing less instead of more, speaking softer, moving slower, waiting longer than he used to, and in a world where people are taught to fix problems quickly, that kind of patience felt unnatural. But this was never about speed, it was about rebuilding something that had been quietly worn down over time. And what Daniel began to notice was not a sudden transformation in Shadow, but a gradual shift in how Shadow responded to him. The hesitation was still there, but it was shorter, the distance was still there, but it was smaller, and those small differences mattered more than anything, because they meant Shadow was starting to Reassess, not just reacting, but reconsidering what Daniel's presence meant, and that is how trust begins to return, not in big gestures, but in micro moments that start to feel safe again. One evening, Daniel sat on the floor instead of the couch, something he had not done in a long time, no phone in his hand, no distractions, just presence, and he did not call Shadow over, he did not reach out. He simply existed in the same space, giving Shadow the choice, and for a while, nothing happened. Shadow stayed where he was, watching, evaluating, just like he had been doing for weeks. But then, slowly, almost cautiously, he stood up, took a few steps forward, paused, then continued, closing the distance on his own terms, and when he finally sat beside Daniel, it was not the same as before, it was more deliberate, more meaningful, as if every inch of that movement had been a decision, not an assumption. And Daniel understood something in that moment that changed everything, that connection cannot be forced back into existence, it has to be invited, created through consistency, through respect, through signals that the dog can trust without second-guessing, and this is where most people struggle, because they want their dog to go back to the way things were. But what they do not realize is that the dog they are seeing now is a reflection of what they have been experiencing, not a problem to correct, but a response to understand. And when Daniel stopped trying to fix Shadow and started adjusting himself instead, the entire dynamic began to shift, not because Shadow changed, but because the environment around him did, the tone, the timing, the predictability of every interaction, and that is when the 7 patterns Daniel had been repeating started to reverse, not all at once, but one by one. His voice became something Shadow could rely on, not something to question. His touch became something Shadow could choose, not something to brace for. His presence became something consistent, not something that changed depending on mood or distraction, and over time, those changes created a new pattern, one where Shadow no longer needed to protect himself in subtle ways, one where hesitation was replaced with curiosity, where distance was replaced with closeness, not because Daniel demanded it, but because Shadow felt safe enough to offer it again. And that is the difference most people never see, the difference between a dog that stays with you and a dog that trusts you, because staying is instinct, but trust is built, and once you understand that, you stop asking why your dog is acting differently. And you start asking what your dog has been feeling all along. It did not happen in a single moment, there was no dramatic turning point where everything suddenly felt fixed, instead it showed up in something much quieter, something easy to miss if you were not paying attention. One morning, Daniel woke up before his alarm, the room still dim, the house completely still, and for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for his phone, he just sat there, letting the silence settle. And then he looked over, and Shadow was already awake, not across the room, not watching from a distance, but closer, lying just a few feet away, his head resting on his paws, eyes soft, not searching, not calculating, just present. And there was something different in that moment, not in what Shadow did, but in how he felt. There was no hesitation in his gaze, no quick glance away, no subtle tension in his body, just a quiet kind of ease that had been missing for weeks. And Daniel did not call him, he did not move right away, he simply let the moment exist, and after a few seconds, Shadow stood up on his own, walked over slowly, and this time, there was no pause, no freeze, no evaluation. He leaned in, naturally, the way he used to, but this time, it meant something more, because it was not automatic, it was chosen, and that is the difference Daniel had been learning to understand, that when a dog feels safe, they do not just respond, they offer themselves freely. And that kind of response cannot be forced, it cannot be trained into existence, it has to be built through consistency, through patterns that make sense, through interactions that feel predictable and safe. And as the days passed, those small moments began to add up. Shadow started greeting Daniel at the door again, not with explosive excitement, but with a steady confidence, his tail moving in a relaxed rhythm, his body open instead of cautious. During walks, he no longer lagged behind or moved with that subtle hesitation, he explored, engaged, moved with purpose, and at home, the distance that had once felt so noticeable slowly disappeared, replaced by a quiet closeness that felt natural again. And Daniel realized something important, that nothing he had done was complicated, There was no advanced training, no special technique, no dramatic intervention. It was simply awareness, the willingness to see what had always been there, the signals he had been missing, the patterns he had been repeating without thinking. And once he changed those patterns, Shadow changed with them, not because he was told to, but because he no longer needed to protect himself in those small, subtle ways. And that is the part most people never fully understand, that a dog's behavior is not just about obedience or personality. It is a reflection of how they feel in your presence, and when that feeling shifts, everything else follows. And the truth is, Shadow had never stopped being loyal, he had never stopped caring, he had just been adjusting to what he was experiencing, quietly, patiently, the way dogs always do, waiting for the moment when things would make sense again. And when they finally did, he did not hesitate. He came back fully, not because he had to, but because he felt safe enough to be himself again. What Daniel understood in the end was not something complicated, it was something most people overlook their entire lives. That a dog does not need a perfect owner, they need a predictable one, not someone who gets everything right, but someone whose actions make sense, whose presence feels stable, whose signals can be trusted without hesitation, because in a dog's world, trust is not built on big moments. It is built on the small ones, repeated over and over again until they become a pattern the dog can rely on, and when that pattern breaks, even slightly, the dog does not protest, they adjust, they become quieter, more careful, more observant, not because they love you less, but because they are trying to understand you again, and that is the part that changes everything, because most people spend their time asking whether their dog loves them, whether they are a good owner, whether they are doing enough, but the better question is this: how does your dog feel around you when nothing is happening, when there are no commands, no treats, no expectations, just your presence, because that is where the truth lives. In those quiet moments where the dog is not reacting, but simply existing near you, and if there is tension there, hesitation, distance, then something deeper needs attention, not in the dog, but in the pattern that has been created over time. And what Daniel learned is that fixing that pattern does not require control, it requires awareness, noticing the way you speak, the way you move, the way you respond in the smallest interactions. Because those are the moments your dog is reading most closely, not your intentions, not your thoughts, but your behavior, your consistency, your emotional clarity. And when those things align, something powerful happens. The dog stops questioning, stops hesitating, stops protecting themselves in subtle ways, and instead, they lean in, they engage, they trust fully, not because they were trained to, but because they feel safe enough to. And that is the difference between a relationship that simply exists and one that truly connects. And the reason this matters is because most of the time, when a dog changes, when they become distant, less responsive, less expressive, people assume something is wrong with the dog, but more often than not, the dog is responding exactly the way they should, based on what they have been experiencing. And once you understand that, once you stop looking for problems in your dog and start looking at the patterns in yourself, everything begins to shift. Because the solution was never about making your dog better, it was about becoming someone your dog can fully trust again. And the truth is, your dog has been telling you how they feel every single day, through their body, their eyes, their choices. The only question is whether you have been paying attention, or whether those signals have been quietly shaping your relationship without you ever realizing it. Because once you do see them, once you understand what they mean, you cannot go back, you start to notice everything. And that is where real connection begins, not in control, not in commands, but in understanding.